Jimmy Kimmel thought it was just another laugh-filled night in Hollywood until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett looked him dead in the eye and dropped one sentence that turned the whole room to stone. He smiled. The audience chuckled. But what she said next, it didn't just silence the show, it cracked something open across America. Because behind the lights, the jokes, and the carefully staged banter, Jasmine brought something real to a place that usually dances around it. Truth. This isn't just a story about a late-night joke gone wrong. It's about what happens when someone finally says what millions have felt but never heard on television. Stick around, because once you hear what she said, you'll never see Jimmy Kimmel or comedy the same way again. Tap like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever been the punchline when you deserve to be heard? The lights inside the El Capitan Theater had a kind of manufactured warmth. Not the gentle kind you get from a table lamp or an old porch light, but the kind that says, "Smile, you're on camera." It was a typical Wednesday night in Los Angeles, and the audience packed into the red velvet seats was ready to laugh, to forget the headlines, to sip on whatever the studio let them sneak in and enjoy a break from the noise of the world. But the irony was, on that particular night, the noise they came to escape was waiting for them just backstage. Dressed in a dark blazer and a resolve sharpened by years of being the only calm voice in rooms full of jokes that cut deeper than they were ever meant to. Jimmy Kimmel walked on stage like he always did, loose, charming, self-deprecating, cracking jokes about his producer's hairline and the latest White House headline. He was a man who'd built a career on poking fun at everybody, claiming neutrality by swinging equally at all sides. To his viewers, he wasn't just a comedian. He was a kind of late-night therapist, laughing at politics so you didn't have to cry about it. But behind that desk, with cue cards in hand and a smirk ready to go, he had no idea that his next guest wasn't coming to play along. He was about to sit face-to-face with something America doesn't often bring onto comedy stages: reflection. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett waited in the wings, watching from the side. Her team had told her to keep it light. "Don't take the bait. He's going to try to disarm you with charm." Her stylist had done her makeup with a soft finish, told her to smile more because it would play better with Middle America. But Jasmine wasn't worried about Middle America. She was thinking about the middle-aged woman in Texas who called her office last month and cried for 10 minutes because her son had been called aggressive in a parent-teacher conference just for asking too many questions. She was thinking about her own mother, a retired school teacher who had once walked out of a staff meeting because someone joked, "You people are always so sensitive." She was thinking about all the times someone like Jimmy made a joke and got a laugh, while someone like her had to clench their jaw and swallow the pain. When Jimmy introduced her, his tone was playful but practiced. "She's fiery, she's fearless, and she's probably about to make me regret inviting her." The audience laughed, not because it was particularly funny, but because they were supposed to. Laughter, after all, was the currency of the room. Jasmine stepped out into that spotlight, and the applause was polite, even warm. But her smile wasn't wide. It wasn't coy. It was composed. She shook Jimmy's hand with the same firmness she'd used to cross-examine a hostile witness, and took her seat with the grace of someone who knew they were sitting in a space not built for them, but commanding it anyway. Jimmy leaned in with his signature charm, making a joke about Texas politics, barbecue, and guns. The crowd laughed, as expected. Jasmine nodded once, the corners of her mouth curving only slightly. She didn't flinch. She let him work the room, flipping through his cards, setting up what he thought would be a night of well-timed quips and half-serious conversation. But Jasmine had something else in mind. Then came the turn. He brought up her recent viral moment in Congress, where she'd corrected a colleague for confusing her with another black congresswoman. "That was intense," Jimmy said with a chuckle. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. "It wasn't intense," she said. "It was necessary." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't throw the moment back in his face, but you could feel the shift. Jimmy blinked, thrown off just slightly, the rhythm of the segment wobbling. "Right," he said, laughing nervously. "Necessary and intense." More audience laughter, though thinner now, more uncertain. Jasmine didn't smile. "I get it," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "This is entertainment. People come here to laugh. But when we keep treating necessary moments like they're punchlines, We stopped taking the root issues seriously, and that's dangerous. The room stilled. You could hear the lights humming. Jimmy, ever the professional, tried to pivot. Are you saying I shouldn't joke about politics? I'm saying, Jasmine replied calmly, maybe you should ask who the joke's really on. That line, that one, didn't just pause the show, it slapped the air out of the room. A second too long of silence stretched across the seats. Jimmy smiled again, but tighter this time. Fair, he said, trying to laugh it off. But I think the point of comedy is that everything can be joked about. That's the beauty of free speech, right? Jasmine didn't blink. Free speech doesn't mean free from accountability. And that was it. That's when the tone changed. Not just in the room, but in Jimmy, in the staff, standing just off stage, in the audience members who had shown up expecting a good time and were now watching something that felt more like a civic awakening than a comedy show. Jimmy tried to lighten things again, grabbing for another card, launching into a game comparing California and Texas bands, plastic straws, Harry Potter books, even empathy. The crowd laughed at the familiar jabs, but it was thinner now, more careful. People started to look around, wondering if it was still okay to laugh. Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't shake her head. She didn't smirk. She just sat, still, grounded. And then came the joke. Jimmy read the final line, loud and exaggerated. No. 1. Woke politicians with great hair and zero patience for jokes. There were a few chuckles, a few gasps, one laugh too loud. But Jasmine didn't move. She leaned back slightly, crossed her legs, and then, with a calm that felt colder than any storm, she said, "You're laughing with the audience, but for people like me, that punchline's a bruise that never healed." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things that had never been said in rooms like this, full of the stories not told in monologues, the realities erased by applause. It held the weight of 1,000 moments where laughter came easy to some, but left scars on others. Jimmy sat frozen, card in hand. For once, the king of late night had nothing to say, and that was only the beginning. The silence that followed Jasmine's words wasn't just awkward, it was sacred. It stretched across the audience like a hush in a courtroom when the truth finally breaks free. The kind of silence that lives in churches after a confession. The kind that doesn't ask for applause because it already holds the weight of every unsaid thing. Jimmy Kimmel sat there, his smirk frozen, his next card limp in his hand. His mind, trained to pivot, to deflect, to turn tension into laughter, suddenly felt too slow. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pointed a finger. But somehow, her calm had cut sharper than any roast, her restraint more stunning than any scripted punchline. The control room upstairs froze too. Theo, the senior camera operator, instinctively tightened the shot on Jasmine's face. It wasn't scripted, no producer called it. But something in the air told him this was the moment. The one everyone would remember, replay, reframe. The lighting tech looked at the feed and whispered, "She just ended the segment without ending it." Back in the studio, the audience wasn't sure what to do. A few shifted in their seats. One woman clutched her handbag tighter. A young couple near the back exchanged glances, the man nodding slowly like he'd just realized something. No one dared laugh. The joke had ended, and the reality had entered. Jimmy tried to smile again. Tried. But the usual rhythm was gone. His fallback charm, that bounce-back reflex, felt miles away. He lifted his mug of water, took a small sip, and let the silence linger longer than any segment ever should. And then, like someone who had just been told something personal, something they didn't know they needed to hear, he simply said, "Okay." He didn't defend the joke. He didn't follow up. He didn't move to the next card. Because for the first time in a long time, Jimmy Kimmel understood that the laughter wasn't mutual, that somewhere between satire and reality, he'd crossed a line not with venom, but with indifference. And Jasmine Crockett had drawn that line back in front of him, clean, sharp, and unshakable. Jasmine sat still, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes soft but locked in. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. She was just done. Not with Jimmy. Not even with the joke. but with the game. The game where certain people get to poke and prod, and others are expected to chuckle and nod. She had played that game in staff meetings, on cable panels, in green rooms, but not tonight. Not anymore. "Do you want to move on?" Jimmy finally asked, not sarcastically, not with irony, but with a tone most in the room had never heard from him before. Humble. Jasmine nodded once. "That's up to you," she said. It was a mercy and a message all at once. The rest of the interview moved on in form only. Jimmy tossed a few safe questions her way, the kind about committee assignments and barbecue preferences. The audience chuckled when expected, clapped politely at the end. But the heartbeat of the room had changed. No one was looking at Jimmy the same, and Jasmine didn't need to say another word to keep it that way. Backstage, the energy was tense. A stagehand who'd been with the show for over a decade muttered, "That wasn't a burn, that was a boundary." In the writer's room, nobody cracked jokes. They watched the live feed like it was breaking news, because it was. When the show wrapped, Jimmy stood up and thanked Jasmine. She shook his hand once more, firm, direct, and walked off stage without looking back. A production assistant moved to escort her, but she waved them off with a polite, "I'm good." She didn't want the hallway conversation, didn't want to be thanked for her composure or pulled aside for a behind-the-scenes apology. She had said what she needed to say, on air, for the world. And now she was gone. But the sentence, the one that cracked the whole room open, didn't go anywhere. By the time the official episode aired, audience-recorded clips were already viral. A grainy vertical video on Twitter had 600,000 views before midnight. One post simply read, "This wasn't a moment, this was a shift." On Instagram, someone captioned a still of Jasmine's expression, "That's the look of someone who's lived through every punchline." Late-night TV, which usually lives and dies by trending hashtags and memeable moments, had never seen something like this. Something that hit harder because it wasn't trying to. In living rooms across the country, the moment played on repeat. In Dallas, a retired pastor watched it with his wife and whispered, "That's what you say when you're too tired to yell." In Chicago, a nursing assistant forwarded the clip to her daughter with the message, "This is what I meant when I said some jokes just land wrong." In Phoenix, a Sunday school teacher included it in her weekly email under the subject, "Know when to speak." But it wasn't just going viral, it was going inward. People didn't just watch it, they felt it. They revisited their own memories, classrooms, boardrooms, holidays, where they had smiled through jokes that weren't funny, stayed quiet when something small but cutting slid across the room dressed up as humor. And Jimmy? Jimmy watched it too. Alone in his office, hours after taping, he replayed the moment, over and over. Not the joke, but her sentence. "You're laughing with the audience, but for people like me, that punchline's a bruise that never healed." He'd written hundreds of jokes, thousands. He'd been booed, praised, canceled, revived. But never had a single sentence made him sit so still, not out of fear, but recognition. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the good guy he thought he was, or at least not always. And the truth of it, that single sentence wasn't just about him. It was about all the rooms where laughter's been used as a shield, where power got to be funny and pain had to be quiet. Jasmine hadn't taken his career. She had handed him a mirror, and what he chose to see in it would determine what happened next. The clip hit the internet like a tremor, but the aftershocks just kept coming. It wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reckoning. The grainy audience footage, captured from the back row and uploaded before the official cut even aired, was raw, imperfect, and real. Within 12 hours, it was everywhere. Twitter feeds, Facebook timelines, TikTok stitches. On the surface, it was just a line. One calm sentence spoken in a studio that had seen 1,000 louder nights. But the quiet in Jasmine's voice said more than most monologues ever dared to. News anchors couldn't stop replaying it. "You're laughing with the audience, but for people like me, that punchline's a bruise that never healed." They played it on loop, the moment that froze Jimmy, the one that turned an entire theater into a confession booth. Conservative outlets called it another liberal meltdown, but even some of them paused before attacking. Liberal commentators hailed it as one of the most important sentences ever spoken on a comedy show. And in between, there was something else happening, something more honest. America was asking itself, when did we start confusing cruelty for comedy? In Ohio, a grandmother sat at her kitchen table watching the segment for the third time. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned down the volume. "That's what I've felt my whole life," she whispered to no one, like the joke's always on us. In a break room at a hospital in Birmingham, a nurse rewound the clip and played it for 3 co-workers. One of them, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, just nodded and said, "She didn't yell, she didn't accuse, she just said it." Radio hosts debated it. College classrooms dissected it. Even Sunday sermons echoed the theme. In Brooklyn, a pastor quoted Jasmine's sentence and added, "Sometimes what needs to be said isn't shouted, it's whispered with a spine of steel." Comedians, normally quick to defend their territory, started texting each other quietly, asking, "Have I ever done that?" Not all of them answered honestly. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel was silent, publicly at least. Behind the scenes, the walls of his studio buzzed with damage control. PR teams wanted to issue a statement. Producers floated a follow-up joke, maybe something self-deprecating to show humility. But Jimmy wasn't laughing. For once, he told them no. No jokes, no spin. Just wait. He spent the next 48 hours watching the internet react, not with the detachment of a celebrity, but with the vulnerability of a man realizing he may have contributed to a wound he never saw. And that, more than anything, was what stuck with him. It wasn't the line itself. It was what it revealed, that maybe the people laughing with him weren't laughing with everyone. Jasmine stayed quiet, too. She didn't tweet. She didn't do interviews. She answered a few texts from close friends, ignored a dozen from network producers, and spent most of her time away from the noise. In Dallas, she walked through her neighborhood with no entourage, just her and the quiet pride of someone who knew she had said something worth sitting in. Her inbox flooded. Messages from teachers, nurses, pastors, veterans, from people who had been told to lighten up their whole lives, from people who had been the butt of jokes and learned to laugh along just to stay included, from people who finally felt seen. And Jasmine read every single one. Some made her cry. Others made her furious, not at Jimmy, but at the world that built platforms on pain and called it entertainment. Back in LA, Jimmy opened a handwritten letter that had arrived at the studio. It was from a retired school principal in Tulsa. It read, "I'm 72. I've watched your show for years. I never realized how many times I chuckled at something that probably hurt someone else. Thank you for letting her say what she said, and thank her for me." He read it 3 times, then again. And that's when he decided to change the script, literally. In the next staff meeting, Jimmy walked in with no jokes, no notes, just a quiet request. "We're not writing over this," he said. "We're listening through it." Writers stared, some nodded. One, a younger staffer, raised a hand and said, "It hit me too." No one laughed, and that's how Jimmy knew it wasn't just performative. Something had shifted. Jasmine's team started fielding calls for interviews, speaking tours, follow-ups. She turned down nearly all of them, not because she was above it, but because the message had already landed. Loud voices weren't needed to echo what was already ringing through America. Her sentence had done the job. Now it was up to everyone else to carry the reflection. Still, the story kept growing. High school civics teachers added it to their lesson plans. Communication departments at universities replayed the clip as a case study in rhetorical power. One professor titled her unit, "The Power of Pause When Words Stop the Room." In church bulletins and HR workshops and boardroom slides, the sentence reappeared, sometimes quoted, sometimes paraphrased, always resonant. 1 week after the interview aired, Jimmy posted something to his personal Instagram. No branding, no video. Just a black square with white text that read, "Sometimes a single sentence can make you rethink a lifetime of jokes. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett, for making me listen." Comments were turned off. He wasn't looking for applause. And that silence, the one that once filled the studio, had followed him home. Not as punishment, but as presence. The presence of truth. The following morning, Jimmy Kimmel sat alone in his home office, staring at his laptop. The glow of the screen cast a pale light on his unshaven face, illuminating tabs of articles, tweets, think pieces, all dissecting the moment he hadn't seen coming. Jasmine's sentence was everywhere, but it wasn't just her words people were talking about. It was the silence that followed, the way he sat there, blinking, caught, unsure. That silence had become the story too. He thought he was used to the cycle. Say something bold, get flamed on Twitter, apologize in a monologue, move on. But this time felt different. The internet wasn't canceling him. It was holding up a mirror, and he couldn't look away. Jimmy's wife, Molly, walked in holding their toddler on her hip. She gave him a long look. "You okay?" He nodded slowly, not convincingly. "You ever watch yourself realize something in real time?" he asked. She didn't respond. She just kissed the top of his head and left the room. In the days that followed, Jimmy showed up to set like clockwork, but the energy was different. The writer's room, once a rapid-fire flurry of half-jokes and rants, had slowed. Some of the team avoided eye contact. Others typed slowly, rereading their own scripts more than usual. Jokes that once felt clever now felt cautious. "Are we overcorrecting?" one staffer asked. Jimmy shook his head. "We're thinking. That's not the same thing." A senior producer suggested booking Jasmine again. A follow-up interview, maybe a chance to show growth. Jimmy declined. "She said what she needed to say. This isn't about giving me a second chance on camera. This is about me figuring out how to live with it." One night, Jimmy sat down with his longtime friend and co-writer Sean. The two of them had been writing together for nearly 2 decades. Over pizza and scotch, they replayed the clip. Sean broke the silence first. "You didn't mean harm." "I know," Jimmy said. "But I didn't mean good either. That's the problem. I was just comfortable." Sean leaned back in his chair. "The worst part about comfort is you forget who paid for it." Jimmy nodded slowly, absorbing that. He started thinking back, not just to Jasmine's segment, but to years of jokes, sketches, interviews. Had he ever paused to ask who those punchlines landed on? Not really. Not until someone finally answered the punchline with pain. In his next monologue, Jimmy avoided politics, pop culture, or scandal. Instead, he told a story. About his dad. About the time his father once said, "Don't tell a joke if you wouldn't tell it to the person's face." He told the audience he'd forgotten that. And he thanked someone for reminding him. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. The crowd clapped. Some cheered. But it wasn't loud. It was measured. Respectful, because they too had watched the clip. And they too were now watching a man grow. Not in defense, but in real time. That night, Jimmy sat in his car in the studio lot, letting the engine idle. He pulled out his phone and opened the message draft he'd started 3 days earlier. A message to Jasmine. He reread it. "I didn't realize how much I didn't see. I've built a career making people laugh. But now I realize not everyone was laughing with me. Some were laughing to get through it. I don't want this to be the end of a segment. I want it to be the beginning of something better. If you're ever open to it, I'd like to talk. Not as a host, as a man who's finally listening." He hit send. Jasmine saw the message late that night. She was sitting on her back porch in Dallas, a blanket around her shoulders, and her second cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her. She read it twice, then again. And for a few minutes, she just sat still, not because she didn't know how to respond, but because she was deciding whether to respond. The truth was, she hadn't expected him to reach out. And yet, there it was. No PR, no corporate statement. Just a quiet request from a man who seemed to be finally hearing the echo of his own words. The next morning, she replied, "Let's talk. No cameras. Just talk." 3 days later, in a quiet room at a neutral studio space in Culver City, Jasmine and Jimmy sat down face to face. No stage lights, no makeup crew, no audience. Just two people who had been on opposite sides of a sentence, now trying to find a shared truth. Jimmy offered her water. She declined. He offered an apology. She listened. And then she spoke. "Here's the thing," she said softly. "I didn't come on your show to end your career. I came because I was invited. But the moment I sat in that chair, I realized I wasn't there as a guest. I was there as content." Jimmy looked down, his fingers tightening around his mug. "You didn't mean harm," she continued. But harm was still done. Not because of one joke, but because of the system that made it normal, comfortable. Jimmy nodded slowly. "I've been realizing that more and more. I thought I was being equal opportunity, but I never asked myself who had the equal power to laugh back." They talked for hours about comedy, about race, about the politics of punchlines, and the emotional cost of being polite in spaces where your lived experience becomes someone else's entertainment. They weren't trying to fix the world, just understand it a little better. At one point, Jasmine leaned in and said, "You know what hit me the hardest? That the moment I spoke that line, the one about the bruise, it felt like I'd just revealed something sacred, and half the world didn't know what to do with it." Jimmy didn't have an answer. He just said, "I'm glad you said it. I needed to hear it." Weeks later, Jasmine quietly returned to Capitol Hill. She didn't do a press tour. She didn't monetize the moment. But across the country, her words had become a benchmark, not just for comedians, but for anyone navigating the line between humor and harm. In classrooms, teachers used the clip to teach restraint and clarity. In HR departments, it sparked conversations about unconscious bias. In homes, it started discussions between parents and children about dignity, respect, and the real meaning of just a joke. Jimmy kept going too, but different now. He brought new voices into the writer's room. He asked new questions. He started reading letters from viewers who'd never written before, people who said they'd felt invisible until that night. And little by little, he learned to tell jokes that didn't ask someone else to carry the weight of them. One night, months after their meeting, Jasmine tuned in to his show. Jimmy opened with a story, not a joke, about a time in high school when he'd made fun of a kid who stuttered. "I thought I was being funny," he told the audience. But years later, that same kid wrote me a letter, told me he remembered every word, that it changed the way he spoke in front of people, and I never forgot that, until I did. Jasmine Crockett reminded me again. The crowd was quiet. Then they clapped. Jasmine turned off the TV and smiled to herself. Not wide, but real. Some moments don't just go viral. They go inward. They don't end careers. They change them. And they don't just challenge comedy. They challenge all of us to look at where we've laughed and who might still be healing from the echo.